one day we withdrew 10,000 from an ATM and started handing out 1,000 rupees cash in a slum area in Mumbai.
There is an inherent prejudice that poor people don't know how to work with money.
People know how to solve their problems. That's the basic idea, right? It's not about what we think is a great solution, but what is a solution that's most useful to you.
If just giving money to somebody can have this level of outcome, that should be the clearinghouse for all ideas that don't deliver that level of outcome. I've often wondered whether giving money to poor people is an easier way to solve for poverty in many cases. I'm glad we have two people today who have not just pontificated on this question, but have done something about it. With us today are Pankhuri and Muzamil from Project Deep, who've actually learned and piloted ideas around this fundamental premise that sometimes giving money to poor people is the best way to help them. What do you call as a very simple idea, which is giving money to people works, is actually super counterintuitive. Yeah. I ask this to a lot of people I work with, and they often feel, and there is an inherent prejudice that poor people don't know how to work with money. And it's a corollary of the fact that rich people know what to do with money. So poor people don't know what to do with money. So general consensus is they'll drink it, they will waste it, they will speculate, etc. Right? Do you hear this often in the work that you do?
Quite a lot. When we started, and we usually describe it as when we started trying to do these programs, people will become lazy and people will drink alcohol. So there was a trust deficit on the citizens or on the people. Over a period of time now, the trust deficit is also on the government, that they're only doing this out of politics. Initial evidence helped. So we started off very, very small. The motivations were Pankhuri and I had gotten promoted respectively in our own organizations, and we wanted to give out a little bit money that we had. So this started off as a pet project, and one day we withdrew 10,000 from an ATM and started handing out 1,000 rupees cash in a slum area in Mumbai.
Okay.
That was our prototyping phase. So the people with whom we were designing suggested just try out as small as possible to start with. And some of those experiences helped shape our belief also, and helped gain confidence on the model.
Tell me, what did they do? What did the first set of people you gave 1,000 rupees actually do with the money?
It's quite fascinating to see. So 10 people we chose, 7 women, 3 men, $1,000. The only thing we were asking that we'll come back after 2 weeks, tell us what you did with the money.
That's all.
That's all. People immediately raised hand that we'll not give our Aadhaar card to you. We're like, we're not asking. The first few people, one person, one family who had stopped the insurance for their daughters. It was their daughter's birthday in those 2 weeks. So when we went after 2 weeks, they had restarted the insurance. Second household, there was a leg injury, so he used the money for medical emergency. One woman had initially told us, don't give me this money, my son will fight with me as to why did you take random money. Some people had hesitations that if you ask the $1,000 back after 2 weeks, we won't be able to repay you. So don't give us the money. Capacity, it gives people to think about what is that they want to prioritize. Those were our initial hypotheses, that can we give agency to people so that they can prioritize education, healthcare, livelihoods for themselves, and they can come. The agency that we wanted to generate was showcased in these small sparks that we saw initially in people, which was quite motivating.
What we've been looking at is exactly this, Rathish, that what are the factors that influence spending, right? So this was our prototype. But through our pilots, we've intentionally experimented in different locations. So our first location was primarily agrarian. So all of their money came from cotton farming. And we see that a lot of people invested only in enhancing or expanding cotton farming. So when I say expanding, what I mean is landless farmers for the first time taking land on rent. Never had they been able to do that with microfinance because that's just too risky. The focus is on repayment as opposed to development. But here it was amazing. And I'm saying this, but experientially, it was so, you could see the spark in their eyes, right? That as soon as you gave it, I knew that if I keep it in my account, it's going to get spent in routine consumption. I didn't want that. And you could see these shifts in 2 days because people were very, very aware that we don't want to keep it in the account. We want to be able to make the maximum use of it. And so that was amazing because we saw the harvest quality also improve because of the reduced reliance on debt. So debt, the awareness of debt being such a big stressor, we had in our mind, back of the mind somewhere, but it became very real here. Because then people were able to use the returns for their own development also. It was not tied to any liability. But that's agrarian. Our second project was with a community that was largely migrating. So what we see is that you get wages. So your normal consumption, even if it's not great, but you're able to match your basic expenses. But you can't invest in big assets. So if you want to do housing, land leveling, water access, not possible, or debt. But debt also you've already taken for funeral or medical expenses, so you're maxed out. So you can't really move to the next layer. And this is where we saw a huge amount of asset investment. So land leveling is a one-time expense, but once that land is cleared, it impacts nutrition. If you have like better water access and are growing vegetables, you can increase your income as well, and just basic security, like food security for the family. So those were on different livelihoods. And our second year was on asset ownership. So we worked in a community, vulnerable community, aspirational district in Nandurbar, but had basic housing and land kind of available. They invested heavily in improving livelihood. So buying livestock, was a river nearby, so putting irrigation facilities. And there you see like the jump is much bigger in the sense of direct income generation. The interesting part in that community was also that people invested in silver. It was something we were not expecting. And when we spoke to them, they said, if I have to make a house, 65,000 may not be enough. I'm putting it in silver. I will accumulate my own savings. When I have a huge pot, I will start it. Or they bought silver ornaments, pledged it for some other asset, and then that would improve their returns, and then they would be able to free up the asset. So they would have 2 assets by the end of a year. So a lot of long-term thinking. And our fourth one was where there was it was the most vulnerable location, people not even having proper housing. So we are trying to see these interactions like you said. So age of course is one, like for older folks we've seen that they want more local livelihoods. They don't prefer to travel or migrate further away. Younger folks may actually want also similar things, because if the migration locations there's a lot more distress there. But security also, like how do you keep your family at home secure? So there are dynamics that we're studying. We do have data now of about 800 families. So now we're kind of consolidating all of it to see what are the factors that influence some of these spending patterns.
The fact that you have the ear to the ground on decision making itself is fascinating, right? Because a lot of it is done in a vacuum where some of this is not known. But let's just step back for a second. Let's chart the journey from you giving your money to you giving other people's money in some form. Just place it on a timeline for me. So when did this first experiment in Mumbai, which year did it happen?
So 2022 November was the prototype. We had a 6-month timeline that we should hit the ground in 6 months if you're designing something to start. Otherwise, we keep designing and analysis paralysis. So the first pilot was in May 23. Literally like a vacuum cleaner salesman, we went from door to door, office to office saying that fund one family. So the budget was 65,000 is what we wanted to do. So what we did is we visited more than 50 villages just to understand, hosting group discussions, village meetings, trying to understand what are the stressors, what are the aspirations, what is that people want to do with when they get the money. So we listed all of the things down, and it was approximately, most of the things were fitting between 50 to 60,000. The second was looking at macro data, floor wage, minimum floor wage, poverty line, and global programs, what have they been giving, what kind of an amount. We landed up to a figure of 65,000 for each household, and we have kept our ears open since as to if this is the right amount. From that point, then started the pitching journey for funders that, okay, 50 household pilot is what we are aiming at, so then we need 32.5 lakhs. The pitch was to each person, don't buy an iPhone this year, please give us 65,000 for each family.
And how many such rounds of fundraise have you guys done so far?
From the first one, we were able to then move to larger ticket size. So moved from just individuals to families who wanted to kind of contribute. So family foundations and CSR and stuff like that. So
let's come back to the point that you were making earlier, right? Which is demographics and others. Like, who is giving money the right thing to do? Because I'm guessing it's not whether it is the right thing to do, but it's the right thing to do for some people, it's not the right thing to do for some people, it's the right thing to do for some problems, it's not the right thing to do for some problems, etc. Maybe nuancing that will be helpful. From your experience of the 800 families and what you're learning and seeing, where is this a good idea? Where is it not a good idea?
Through our experience and also through some like reading of literature, right? A couple of big programs for poverty alleviation, if I were to speak of it, is the graduation approach, which combines a little bit of like in-kind transfer, a stipend, capacity building. And then you have microfinance like credit, which has really been touted as poverty alleviation because of the capital access. Cash transfers is newer slightly in this space, right? But of course, if you look at Give Directly or if you look at some of the economists are speaking about cash transfers, we are almost looking at it as a pyramid structure. So the higher the vulnerability, the more support, very intuitively, right? So if there are communities where you will need to do capacity building, where maybe if market access isn't there, you have to do in-kind transfers as well. And therefore, a combined approach or a portfolio approach works for the absolute ultra poor. It's above that things start getting mixed up. Above that layer, credit has been pushed, right? But now we're seeing a lot of delinquency in microfinance. We're seeing a lot of stressors rather than enablers coming up. You see all these stories and news articles as well, right? About at the extreme suicide, but at the basic level, just inability to repay and just having bad credit after that. So that's the middle layer where cash transfers is situated, right? Which is the moderate poor. So they don't need the complex programming, so that you don't need to take that much of an effort to scale heavy programs. So you can drop all those levers and just do cash. But they're also not at that level where repayment burdens can kind of be borne by them. So there's a middle layer of about 300 million or so that we see, which is defined by the World Bank, right? Moderate poor, where cash grants or returnable grants would work well. And then microfinance, they will graduate to microfinance, where, you know, once they have a bit of stability of income, a slightly more stable livelihood, then they can start repaying, and then that becomes the tip of our pyramid. So we are looking at that structure. I feel like a lot of conversation on it globally, but in India, nobody's looked at this pyramid like that and tested it out to see how do people graduate across these levels of poverty, so to say. So that's been like a lot of focus for us this year will be on like figuring that out, like what are the vulnerabilities that we can address through cash and then map the journey to their graduation to formal finance.
What are the characteristics of these people? Like typically, do they have land or do they not have land?
So they may have land, but they may not have the capital to invest in it, right? We've seen these in our programs itself, that we have land, but we don't have money, so we are doing wage work, right? So you may have the basic necessities, you may have like basic market access, for example, but you don't have the liquidity. So the way we very simplistically define is where the capital access is the main deal breaker. Some of the characteristics even from the ultra poor may be relevant, where you're in a remote location, may not have housing, but the opportunity is much more. Exposure is more because you may have migrated to cities or other places, and therefore you have a better kind of definition of what you want to do if you have capital. So I don't think these have been stringently defined, if I'm very, honestly, because it goes up and down, but I think that's the difference, like your opportunities, exposure, and capital being the main deal breaker. Like if you have it, then everything else kind of can fall into place.
Place being a constant, the point you made is physical infrastructure, which is access to water, but it's also the social infrastructure, right? Like if you have access to a good doctor, at least a decent school, things like that, I think make a difference, because that's something money can't solve. It has to be provisioned in some sense, and that's probably a good definition for an ultra poor versus a poor in some sense as well, because health, I'm sure, is a big determinant of people's cash flow in some form. The other is the point that you made around is the flywheel kicking off, which is you can do this once, there's benefit, but it stays on for a while and sort of disappears. But if it kicks off a flywheel and they upgrade themselves to the next level of access, then that's a massive ping. And you mentioned that income's improved by 20-30%. I have a tricky question. The favorite focus of social sector is capacity building and awareness building. The general sense is people don't know. We have to tell them, right? Even though market always tells us that there was no training program for UPI, people used UPI, no training program for Ola and Uber, drivers came. We still believe market access, market capacity building is very important. From what you're saying, people figure out where the information asymmetry is there, where value is. It's not a problem of not knowing where money can be made. It is a function of not having the cash to do it. Because the number of entrepreneurial training programs that I hear all the time, right? We should put an entrepreneurship in a box and things like that. Is the narrative from your side counter to that? In most cases, when you give people money, are they able to find a sound way to multiply that value? Or does that require support in terms of literacy, advisory, capacity building and all of that?
The benefit of cash is different people already, the latent potential that we spoke about, they do have some skill sets is what we have seen in the evidence. and they leverage those skill sets to then further. The people who don't start learning. So we start looking at poverty not as an individual household problem, which is when you want to solve for the existing gaps, but you look at a complex as a surrounding problem. So a hamlet, if you want to pick out of poverty, you don't necessarily do a livelihood programs, because then you start saturating. It not automatically starts diversifying. So some people will pick up roof building, some person will set up a ration shop, some person will, and when we saw the farmers taking land on rent, they went with farmers who were already taking land on rent. In our pilots, we have seen that, and at a larger scale, to answer your question, governments are setting up your banking sakhis, krishi sakhis, which are essentially your local consultants who support more, and there is knowledge infusion through them in the community. So there is a requirement of a cash plus infrastructure, which I think some of these infrastructures are already starting to help with, is what we have seen. So the first time we went to a rural bank, they told us we don't open bank accounts. And we were like, what do you guys do? It's like walking into a barber shop and saying we don't cut hair. Then we realized there is a banking correspondent who does all the banking, starting an account, all the operations happening through a banking correspondent, and that's the point of contact.
Do you see a gap in the infrastructure that is required for people to translate money to value?
So I would say yes and no. There is, to build on what he's saying, but the gap doesn't need to be plugged by us for two reasons. One is that the realities that they live in is very different from those who are designing programs, right? It's not an us versus them, but that is like, we're not living in that particular situation. And B, their interconnected informal networks are strong enough to plug those gaps. So in our programs also, we've seen that not everyone on the first day knows what to do with the money. They're going to have to sit with it, think about it. But you have people in the village itself who will help, but not only those who've received the money, even outside. Like we have people from outside who are like shop owners or vendors who will support to say, okay, if you are setting up a shop, I can share my connects in terms of where to get things from. All of this with the caveat that that's why we're not talking about ultra poor. So if you are in that space where, that's why I spoke about exposure as well. If that's not there, then of course you do need that layer of capacity building. We're talking about the space where only capital is the constraint. You actually don't need to kind of put in that programmatic layer. What we've seen is that aspirations is what Muzamil spoke about, but also creativity. I think this is one example we've spoken about a lot, but I'll still share it, is one family bought a speaker set, right? Because they realized that in all festivals, weddings, demand is there for music, but nobody has, they have to go 4 villages away, and if it's a very peak season, they will not get it. Very nuanced idea by a school child, but told to his parents that this is what we should do, and you see that it works well, it works great. Our programs can't design for that. We have very standardized kind of, not in a bad way, but there is a limit to which we can put creativity in a program. Not everyone can kind of fit, so it becomes very exclusionary. Untied money, aspirations, creativity, and just customization to your context is what it enables. So we do other things. We build a developmental narrative. We do say that, this is, we know you know what to do with it, and this is for your growth, and we try and spark conversation between each other, right? For sharing of ideas. We show examples from our previous projects, but it's all very, very light touch. Ours is 800 households, but if you look at empirical data from other places, like Give Directly has done $1 billion of cash transfers in Africa and other places. They don't have a model of any capacity building or training. And you will see all the results are consistent with the fact that people know how to solve their problems. That's the basic idea, right? It's not about what we think is a great solution, but what is the solution that's most useful to you. And I think people are best placed.
Playing a devil's advocate, right? Societies are open systems. Whenever you introduce a input like this, the society also responds to that.
Yeah.
So when people know that folks have liquidity, chit funds will open up. Alcohol shops will open up. And it's a function of market responding to supply, right? Suddenly there's new supply, market responds to that, right? Again, both in the experience of Give Directly and other stakeholders and in yours, do you see that market response happening? Where because suddenly you have 65,000, somebody is saying that is money to be made, right? More TV sales, for example. Yeah.
I'll actually go back to the Seva pilot that happened in 2011. they actually saw that in the first place, money lenders got super annoyed because like they thrive on the fact that the money is not repaid, so that they are earning interest. Suddenly, everyone's money was repaid. That resulted in them not wanting to give more loans in that space. So once the program was tapering off, people would have been left with less liquidity, and that's where Seva also set up that revolving fund, so that that once they exit the ecosystem, there's no problem. So that's one example that yes, these things crop up, and we do need to be more aware of what is the response. In our case, because of that experience, we do a lot of like fraud prevention conversations, that right from where to withdraw the money, because it could start with your banking correspondent. They see you have 65,000, you not know. And it could go up to any other level. So fraud prevention is one. Second, in terms of buying commodities and more consumerism, I feel like it's such a small part of the larger sum that sometimes it's also okay.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
who are we
like
to judge?
Exactly, who are we to judge? So I would divide it to two levels. One is like absolute fraud and like malpractice, which we want to avoid against. But this kind of just choices for self, like, or what you consider as higher aspiration, that I probably have a new phone, it's all right. I mean, I think that's not something we're even trying to actively control. We haven't seen it in a big way that, everyone suddenly just bought a new car. That's not what happens. Not in our programs, not outside, because your big stressor is what you'll address first. Right. So you will make a roof, and then if you have some money, you probably buy something.
There's the other side of the coin to this also. So positively, the market also responds to some of this. In African pilots, we have seen a ROSCA being set up. So a kitty, when you're giving monthly transfers, so India right now transfers 2,80,000 crores worth of cash transfers from the governments. 70% of it is monthly cash transfers, which is 1,500, 2,000 rupees every month. A lot of it goes into consumption. The theory of change that we've been talking about is asset building. So how do you get people to build assets so that it's more sustainable, long-term benefits are seen? In Chhattisgarh, what happened is rural banks started creating asset vouchers. So the guarantee that came for it was the government giving 1,500 rupees to the people. And using that, they started giving 25,000 asset vouchers, using which people again bought agricultural assets. That's a positive market responding to what's happening in the state. Same we have seen in smaller pilots also, the ROSCA African example, where people came together, said, okay, I can't do anything of this $1,000, let all of us 10, 15 people put it together, one person will get it every month, they can buy an asset, and 15 people can buy an asset. So that's some of the market responses. And to your earlier question also, social sector does need to do more programs if there is transitionary things that we are aiming at, like natural farming, for instance. You don't necessarily need to teach people agriculture, but if you're aiming, now the aspirations are going up, those are the interventions that can come in play, along with cash transfers that are needed for people to do their own capital investment. So it's partnership model rather than an patriarchal model where we need to tell people how to use the money, is what we are aiming at here.
Convincing donors about this, and you briefly mentioned CSRs and so on as well, right? One is for you to have the conviction that this works. Second is what you talked about, showing the evidence. Yeah. But there is also a dynamic where today, and I was talking to somebody just before this meeting, there is a need to be actively involved. Yes. And that active involvement comes with their perspectives, biases, and thoughts, well-minded thoughts of what will work. How do you sort of manage that tension? Because this is, until you see it, you're not going to believe it.
I think some of the new age donors or the newer generation, second generation maybe, a lot of this has now come into like economic studies and stuff like that. So those are early sort of, early supporters were those who at the base understand basic income as a model, are not tied to any other. So it's also difficult to shift people from thematic focus. Like if you're already bought into an idea, it's difficult. So I think what worked for us is that our early supporters were this archetype, young folks who have either studied some parts of this in development economics or are not already kind of married to a model. And then the later part of convincing is based on what I already mentioned about evidence, about newer models. I think also at a base level there is this underlying belief or understanding that we need to do something different. What that different is this too radical? Is it okay if we just do a bit of test? And then over time champions. So if you have a credible funder already, or if you have, for example, somebody who's speaking on your behalf so that you're not telling your own story, that really helped. So those are the 2-3 levers. We've been very actively trying to build external voices to speak more about this. So these are a few of the things that have worked. Still a long way to go. I feel like there is still that inherent trust deficit and these structures that are difficult to break out of also, right? Cash is a horizontal.
Yeah.
I may, like for so long our pitch was that cash works across outcomes, that's why it works. But we are also having to change the way we talk about it to fit into existing structures of CSR, which is health, education, environment, and entrepreneurship. We know cash cuts across all, but how do you tailor your pitch to fit a particular portfolio so that you're able to speak to the opposite person? That's been a learning for us over time. So instead of trying to pitch what we think is the USP, which is cross-cutting, sure it's cross-cutting, but what is the one big thing you can highlight for the other person to relate?
Everybody's favorite question when it comes to non-profits is scaling. How do you scale this? What will you do, etc. And as I think about the work that you do, I don't think you would want to go from 800 households to 800,000 households. Just cash management of that I think will be very complicated. I think the ultimate engine for you is the government, because whether we like it or not, cash transfers are something governments do all the time, right? Tell me about that. How do you see the role of scale and how do you see the role of government?
What we did last year is we published a state of the sector report where we looked at 72 unconditional cash transfer schemes across the country. That's where the 280,000 crore figure came, that this is the quantum of money that's already going from government's bank account to citizens directly. 280,000 crores is 10% of overall welfare spending that the government does, also almost 1% of GDP. So there is the big question, there are 3 big questions when it comes to policy, is where will the money come from? So the money is coming. There is a big question on fiscal prudence getting built. The 2016-17 economic survey suggested that subsidies can be now shifted to cash transfers. 2008, I think there was a big problem statement that was shared upon that it takes 3 rupees to deliver 1 rupee of ration. That is when the DBT infrastructure started getting set up in the country. What we do know is that the first subsidy that was moved, which was the LPG subsidy that was moved to DBT mechanism, the country saved 74,000 crores on it. So where the money will come from is moving some of these subsidies to cash transfers might help in a sustainable fashion. Right now there is expenditure switching that's happening. So that's the scale pathway again. So 14-15 states in the last 3 to 4 years have massively adopted cash transfer schemes. The sustainability comes from some of these aspects. That's the fiscal prudence building. Second is looking at policy design. To your earlier question is what should NGOs do and how should they participate? There is a huge question on how can policies be designed better. We do know lump sum cash transfers may help better with asset generation versus a monthly cash transfer. And if that is the agenda, then we have built out an FACT framework: frequency, amount, communication, and timing, that should accompany the cash transfers. At what frequency you should give money, for what purposes, what should be the amount, again for which purpose the scheme is designed for, the communication alongside it, and the timing. All of these 4 affect how people use the money at the end of the day. For farmers, the model is slightly different. Before each sowing season, they get the money. For women, the model is slightly different. So intentional policy design is a big thing to understand what are the outcomes and how hence the cash can be designed. Although this is grants, it can be designed to cater to a specific agenda and an outcome. And there isn't that research, or those playbooks are still not available in the country. The governments have done it. Social sector can do more pilots, identify these models, financial models for each outcome, and create these playbooks specifically for policymakers to then scale this further. Beyond this, there is targeting. So farmers and women as a target group has been largely targeted. There are some groups that are still excluded. Can we bring in cultivators, which are non-landholding farmers who do agriculture? Can we bring them into the existing farming scheme for farmers so that they are also covered under this, given that this is a great social protection safety net that the government is building? Who are the other target audiences that are left out? And cash is across. There are 72 schemes. So cash is there for fishermen, it's for prison rehabilitation. It cuts across a lot. So there is a lot to be done in terms of ensuring the right targeting is also happening.
Right.
Post this is ensuring, identifying implementation gaps. I think Dwara Research has done a fantastic report on state of exclusions, which identifies where are the implementation gaps in the current infrastructure. fixing those and then doing M&E for this. So across the value chain is what we are offering or starting to work with state governments also.
So there is subsidies, there is cash transfers. Within cash transfers, there is unconditional cash transfers to conditional cash transfers, which is that if a girl studies till 18, I will give money. If you do this, I will give money, etc. What else is there, right? And then there is scheme delivery, which is, so what does this welfare bucket of things cover today? Maybe if you give me a very high level overview, and then let's jump into a little bit of that a little bit more deeper.
So I think welfare, like you correctly said, has evolved, right? We started with very program delivery kind of approach, which was more like PDS and those kind of schemes. Then you move to more of a rights-based narrative where you got like Manrega and more of like how do you, this is your right kind of language. And then the DBT mission, which was like how do we reduce the friction points? How do you reach the citizen directly? And then within DBT, I think UCT, like cash transfers is the next big wave. So if I were to break it down, I think you've actually covered it. Like 280,000 crores is cash. About 4 lakh crores continues to be subsidies. And then you have infrastructure, of course, that the government builds, like your Anganwadi schools, etc. And then there are direct programming that still happens. So you have asset transfers, you have capacity building, you have counseling. So those are also areas. So broadly, these are the 4. In DBTs and financial instruments, again, there's a further breakdown because you have credit-based instruments, you have insurance, and you have cash transfers. So multiple ways to break the pie, but this is largely the gamut, if I would say so.
And I think it's also one of the questions with time conditional cash transfers is it a time-bound program or is it going to be perpetual, right? Because one of my beliefs is also that in certain cases, to shift the behavior to a model that can be accepted by society requires a certain push. Yeah. But if it's perpetually done, perverse incentives start to creep up. Because even on the ground, we know for institutional births, there are perverse incentives right now because we know money is being delivered, etc. Yeah. And if after a period of time, the money doesn't change because incentive is provided, like you rightly said, the problem is probably elsewhere.
Exactly.
And figuring out what that is, I think will be very, very important. But the other element to this, and this sort of speaks to the targeted subsidies, targeted benefits that you're providing, which is fishermen, and the Dwara report as well, is that the exclusion risk is always very high, right? Why don't you talk a little bit about that? Like, what is the risk of exclusion that we are talking about, both in the Dwara report you highlighted and in the work that you're doing right now?
Yeah. So I'll start, but please add in. So conditionality is at 2 levels, Rathish. One is to qualify for the scheme itself, right? That in itself makes the citizen go through multiple hoops. So the exclusion piece comes up more at that level, where you have to prove certain things that I am X, I am doing Y. So not natural conditions, let me start with the difference between targeting and conditionality. So cash transfers targeted at women is not a conditional transfer. That's a medium of targeting. Whereas saying that you have to complete 5th grade is a condition. Because it's not a natural progression. You may or may not finish it. You have to achieve certain outcome to get it. Targeting, I think, works in the sense that you're able to identify a certain group, their challenges, and address that. Right. Conditionality means that you are forcing a certain outcome without knowing whether it's going to be useful for that particular person or what are the opportunity costs that are happening in the way. And that's where the exclusions happen. So if you're trying to solve for education by saying that you'll get the money after you finish 5th grade, the problem could lie elsewhere. It could be that I don't have people to support me on my farm and therefore I'm removing my children from school. Then this is kind of you're solving for a different problem, like you said. So that's when exclusions happen. So you will continue to see that then even though you're eligible, you're probably not being able to get the benefits. And the second part of the conditionality is the monitoring. So your government is investing then heavily in trying to understand whether a particular event has happened or not. So there's a lot more machinery and that leads to delays and other kind of administrative issues. Then there are conditionalities on usage of money, which is even more difficult because if you're giving money for a specific thing, we may see that in microfinance, right? Like you see that this is a livelihood loan, but we have spoken to people who've taken a loan saying it's for livelihood, but probably used it for something else. So that kind of monitoring at the usage level for conditional transfers is way more difficult, at least at a country level. So that's not necessarily to your exclusion point, but to your point on saying that then why are we even putting so many systems and structures in place. So that's a little bit of how conditional transfers play out.
Some middle pathways there is labeled programs. So you don't necessarily put conditions, but you communicate why the government is doing this or labeling it well, and that has seen almost as good as really good results. The first Raitu Bandhu was also a farmer investment support scheme, was the name of the scheme itself. So then you know that they are trying to support investment into agriculture with that scheme. So naming it, messaging around the scheme really helps. As compared to if you say this is Ladki Bahin, Lado Lakshmi, some of the other schemes which are not labeled necessarily. And when we were on the Charcha panel, and Mr. L.K. Atik said this really nicely, that people are receiving money, but they don't know why they are receiving this money. They don't know where to use it. And labeling really changes things. In some of our programs, we've seen that people wouldn't touch the 65,000. They would use other money for consumption, and they would keep this for investment specifically.
On the nuance of the targeting, like you took an easy example, which is women. It's verifiable, observable by and large. But let's say if you're a farmer, it's actually not a verifiable fact today, right? Large Bollywood actors are farmers, we do know it. So are fishermen, and so on. And there is exclusion risk in just the burden of proof being on the person receiving the money because of the lack of a unified definition of inherent risks where the targeting is not as simple as women, right? Do you see that?
Yeah. In fact, even though women is a simple example, I'll start with that. We've still not solved for migrants, right? Because we have in Mumbai, for example, if you just take this example, so much of the informal workforce is migrants. But they're excluded from the benefit. I mean, this is a classic debate. It's not only about cash, but we've not solved for that even within cash is the one point. Within farmers, of course, Muzamil brought it up even earlier, is that land has become the only constant way of looking at this. We are not able to look at tenants. We are not able to look at landless farmers. And how do we solve for that? I feel like that is the next way forward almost, to say how do we remove these exclusion errors. Some states have started doing it. So you see that Telangana, for example, had they've done an extensive drive to be able to identify who are tenant farmers. So, but then that needs that back work of, so the problem is more in the data as opposed to the scheme, to say that how good is the state's data. Now we are seeing things like household ID coming up to see, like you can see what are the benefits being saturated on a particular household along, and then that gives you a glimpse into everything else, their asset ownership, income levels, etc., to be able to plan these schemes better. But short answer is that yes, targeting has improved over time because we've moved from inclusion to exclusion. So we've stopped saying you have to prove X, Y, and Z. You have to say that you will be excluded if, say, even within women in Maharashtra, if your household income is above 2.5 lakhs, if you are a government employee. So all women except makes a very big difference rather than saying only if you do this, right? It's a small nuance, but makes a difference.
I want to now switch to my favorite topic, which is universal basic income, right? Irrespective of our conversation, I feel that we are trying in an economy that does not create median jobs to ensure equitable value for everybody, right? Like I always say that we have a U-shaped curve of economy, which is there are very highly skilled jobs and there are completely unskilled jobs. The middle jobs that used to exist are actually shrinking, right? Which means that at some point, social protection as a way to provide basic income for people is critical. And it's not a function of fiscal value, it's a function of just the way society is going to be structured, because value creation is probably going to be in two ends of the spectrum. So one, I'd love to hear your thoughts about how do you see universal basic income, and also what is the right amount for universal basic income, because that's also the big question, right? Is it good enough for you to get one meal a day, or is it good enough for you to thrive?
So I'll just latch on to what you said, right? I feel like the nature of social challenges we are dealing with is so different now than it was earlier. The few big factors we see are just the frequency of climate shocks, the jobless growth, which is linked to tech, AI, and many other factors, and the geopolitical risks, right? Like suddenly whole industries are shrinking because of some regulation that has been changed and putting people out of employment, adding to the job question. Universal basic income is that floor, right? Like it, again referring to the 2016-17 survey, I love, I don't know if you've seen it, it's actually a debate between Mahatma Gandhi and Mahatma Gandhi, because he can argue on both sides of the spectrum to say that, you know, should you be giving free money versus should you have to earn it? And the entire conversation is that debate. And very nicely put that in a world where inheritance exists, money is anyway delinked from work. So only when it's for the masses or for the population that is vulnerable do we question it. But otherwise, rest of society doesn't always have to work to get money. All of this coming to the point that now we are in that reality where we don't have work for everybody, and there are multiple shocks that can further deteriorate the situation. Universal basic income does become that floor, right? Everything is linked to poverty. Like, we don't want to see mass crime happening. You want to maintain basic law and order and justice and peace in society. You do have to make sure that at least basic survival is maintained. To your question on amount, I feel like there isn't a silver bullet answer that I have. We have tried to benchmark it to certain things. A lot of the transfers we do currently are in the range of about 30% of MPC. Is that good enough or not? I don't yet have an answer. But we are looking at more aspirational benchmarks also. We do have living wage benchmarks for all states. Does the state have to provide all of it? Maybe not. But can we benchmark to that as opposed to just consumption? Those are some of the big questions we have. It will depend on what outcome we're gunning for. Like with basic income, do we just want to say you should get 2 square meals a day and that's it? Or do we want to say that this is for you to maintain a certain standard of living and therefore it should be different? A lot of what we've said, my personal belief is that basic income should be the floor, and then some of these nuanced needs, because as a country now we do have the money. Like 10, 15, 20 years ago, the question would have been, do we have the money? I think now we do. So can we do the basics right and then have more nuanced outcomes built out for different demographics?
We are already seeing as a reality outside the country. Marshall Islands is the first country, I think, that went and announced a basic income that's providing $800 quarterly installments to its citizens. After COVID, we have seen a large pickup across multiple countries doing this. I think India is doing the largest cash transfers. South Korea is very close to it. US has 150 pilots across, and then you see Sam Altman doing the largest pilot, Give Directly being the largest player, but there are very small pilots also happening. There are multiple universities set up now. So University of Pennsylvania has a basic income lab that is looking across 40 of these pilots that are happening and gathering data to understand how this can be done in the best possible manner. So you see an ecosystem that's already set up towards creating a basic income for people, and there are champions for it as well in the system. We are trying to set up the similar ecosystem in India also that's thriving towards making this into a reality. To answer some of the critical questions that we discussed today, where will the money come from? What does sustenance look like? What is the right amount to give? How to best ensure that everybody gets it and there are no exclusions in it? I think that's the ecosystem that we are also trying to build within the country to make this a reality for us also, hopefully soon.
Yeah. And one of the worries that everybody, I'm sure, has is that India has a very poor track record of reversing things. Like, I feel like the fertilizer subsidy should have been reversed a long time ago. But once given, it's a lock, right? So while you say India has money, I'm sure it is on the mind of a lot of policymakers saying, hey, when things are going well, it's okay. You look at Europe and you look at the burden that we carry. I mean, it has delivered significant benefits to the society, right? I've had a chance to experience it firsthand. But when the going gets hard, it becomes harder to sustain that system. Will we be at a place where we can make those choices? And as you said, it's a new idea. There's probably a lot of learning that's going to come across. We have one of the largest denominators in the world to be able to try it. So be able to see what it's going to look like, I think is going to be very, very important.
I think the problem is also with the terminology of universal basic income, because universal scares people, basic is not defined, and income is linked to work. So I feel like a lot of people are also trying to break down the terminology and like get to the simple objective that we want to make sure that we don't reverse the progress we've made on poverty and actually accelerate it. So that's one part. But I think Karthik Muralitharan's paper on inclusive growth dividend, which is the different name he has put, very actually, it's not so much about reversing or exiting, but actually linking it to GDP. So his idea is that start with a really small amount, which is not contentious, but then link it to the GDP. So if there are fluctuations in the country's growth, it reflects to the city. It's almost like profit sharing for shareholders, right? But the real question is, like you said, like we're not only a large country, but a diverse country.
Yeah.
So how do you adapt it to our reality? But I think since the conversation has picked up, a lot of new thoughts are emerging, and the hope is that we're able to make some of this a reality in a good way.
I want to end with a question for what does all this mean for philanthropy? Right? Because, and this has been a question that's on my mind for a long time, right? When do you know something is not working? In markets, it's actually quite easy. You build something, nobody buys it, you know it doesn't work, you shut off, you go. Philanthropy does not have a clearinghouse of bad ideas, right? Something doesn't work, you think it's working, you like the person, but this is kuch to bala ho raha hai, argument. So bad ideas thrive in philanthropy for a very, very long time. One of the things that I'm looking at the work you're doing and saying is that if just giving money to somebody can have this level of outcome, right? That should be the clearinghouse for all ideas that don't deliver that level of outcome. Yes, we should do more, but we should do things that go above and beyond the delivery of outcomes that we are delivering. That's a very compelling argument and a very contentious one, right? In doing the work that you're doing, how do you think this is influencing the larger conversation on philanthropy?
So what you've described is actually cash benchmarking, which is a real thing.
Okay. Damn, just when I thought I had an original idea.
USA back in the day had really pushed this idea of cash benchmarking.
Right.
If cash does even equal, not better, then we should do cash because it's more dignified. And then everything else can surround. There are in fact a lot of papers on cash benchmarking as well, including like sanitation and cash, mental health interventions and cash. And a lot of these RCT kind of trials that have happened, which show that cash transfers do have equal or better outcomes. How do you implement that in philanthropy is a huge question of mindset change, I think, because of these things that we've discussed. Also, this need to be actively involved, this idea that we know more, and this basic mistrust that people don't know what to do with money.
And that's exactly answer to the second question, which is what is the role of philanthropy? Can we do more pilots? Can we create that ecosystem where there are more people talking about this, more conversations happening, more evidence coming from the ground? And that's the catalytic role that social sector has also played in multiple other schemes that we have seen, or multiple other tools of welfare that we have seen come before this, where there were smaller pilots, smaller experimentation, and then once there is proof of concept, once you know it's working, once you know the modality of it, what are the limitations of it, then you take to a scale level. I think a lot of testing does need to happen. Usually it's you test one idea, then you scale it. In our case, 2,80,000 crores is already going out, so we are behind and we need to catch up with what's already happening in the country. So I think social sector needs to move to what government has already moved to and test more ideas.
You know, as I'm talking to you, you know, it's interesting. There are certain things that are enduring truths. Like to respect a person's agency is an enduring truth, right? But there are certain ideas whose time has come, right? I feel like cash transfer is an idea whose time has come because we've tried many things which were true to the context of the time that we were in then. We made the choices we made in 47, in 71, and all of this, 91. We have a set of new choices to make now, right? And so, having seen what MFI has done, having seen what conditional cash transfers have done, is there an appetite to take another experiment? That's one question. And in some sense, we are already doing it, but can we do it more mindfully? Second is the technology readiness to do something. Because we now have JAM, because now we have so much data, we can actually be smarter about giving in ways that is a lot more mindful. I think it's another reason why the idea for the time has come, right? And a lot of the enabling factors exist. There is global evidence, there are smaller pilots, etc. And it sort of feels like we are at the cusp of something that we can try at a very large scale. And as you rightly said, it's going to take time. But to be more intentional about it, I think is going to be very, very critical. And honestly, this is the kind of place where philanthropy's role is catalytic. Because when something becomes an enduring truth, then what is the point of philanthropy having to do more of it, right? But to when a point there is uncertainty, when there is high risk to be taken, to catalyze the ability of the ecosystem to adopt it faster is really where philanthropy has to come. The other reflection I'm having as I'm talking to you through this entire conversation is a question of agency, right? Is this idea that there are certain problems people can solve for themselves and there are certain problems people cannot. We swing on both sides of the problem. In certain cases, we don't build the roads, the hospitals, the schools that people can't solve for themselves. And we expect people to figure it out for themselves. On the other hand, there are some problems people can solve for themselves, which is, if I had some money, what will I do with it? And we over-engineer solutions there. This trust in human agency and the ability to build on it, it's actually, as intuitive as it may seem, very, very hard for people to assess, right? And hopefully, beyond all of the conversations we had on cash transfers, this conversation on what does true agency look like and how do we let it manifest, I think is going to be a very, very interesting conversation to have. Yeah. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Rathish.
Wonderful conversation.
Thank you so much. Thank you for summing it up so well. I think it was a great articulation of everything we've discussed.
This is lovely. Thank you so much for doing this.
No, pleasure is entirely mine. Entirely mine.